Welcome to this year's first Soundbox. Soundbox aims to explore and celebrate the links between the various parts of music making, between performers and instruments, between instrument and composer, between composer and performer, and then by extension from performer to audiences, from, say, instrument making to the other crafts or the arts, to writing, to photography, basically all the things in which music finds its context. Soundbox has evolved in the circumstances, the environment of the Royal Academy of Music Museum. Normally, we will be giving this session or enjoying this session, exploring this session in the string gallery on the first floor of the Academy. I will be sitting between two Stradivarius violins, a viola and the famous Viotti Strad, and on the wall behind me will be the words of Benjamin Britten, talking about the fact that he did not think easily in words but in music because words were not his medium. So even though we are giving this first session on Zoom, everything we'll be doing will be in the context of the idea of the museum, in the what Simon Shaw-Miller, the art historian, calls the provisional space that a museum offers, the chance to try things out, to play with ideas, to explore. And before I start, I'd very much like all of you, those of you I haven't met, to share ideas with me about how you'd like the class to develop, things you find fascinating, exciting, inspiring, and so we can share them with each other, and maybe the class will find its way in an increasingly exciting manner. Whilst there are a limited number of formal classes each term, as those of you who've worked with me before know, I like to set up online meetings where we can meet less formally to discuss ideas in between the classes, and those will develop naturally as we go along. Today I want to talk a little bit about my own work, and particularly in the context of working with the past. I'm not somebody who specializes, as I will explain, and I don't want you to give the impression or get the impression that I work exclusively with music of the past. In fact, half my work is with new music. But this is an exploration of some of the challenges that we face, or some of the excitements there are of working with instruments and spaces and music of the musicians and artists who've gone before us. On the 19th of September, I gave my first concert to a live audience since our lockdown began. A pre-booked group of 30 people, the limit, found their way to the astonishing 1682 Wren Church of St Mary Abchurch. It's a London square mile. Standing in front of Grinning Gibbons, a 1686 Reredos under William Snow's 1708 dome painting, I played a program of works from the 17th century and a new piece by the Macedonian composer Mihailo Trantofilovsky. I used three instruments, one made by Girolamo Marti in Cremona in 1629, a viola made by Jacob Raymond just around the corner from the church. In fact, it's the earliest surviving English viola in 1641, and possibly one of the earliest surviving playable violins, an anonymous instrument made in Brescia, down the road from Cremona in 1570. I used a variety of setups and tunings. So I played instruments both in modern setup and what we call early setup, and different scordature. Around the music, I wove texts by writers from the 1600s, some of my favourites: Anne Finch, Elizabeth Cavendish, Samuel Pepys, and Hook. At some point in this short hour of music, it seemed as if everybody in the room remembered why we do this. The magic that can happen when we share music, art, words, in a space, and most importantly, together. And everything I say in the next few paragraphs is in that context. There's not really any difference between the way I played the music of our own time and the music of the past. I have an equally inconsistent approach to everything I play. This situation is compounded because I really don't have the ability to specialise. If that makes me a generalist or perhaps an interloper in the various areas that I'm active, then all that I can say is that's the method, the means of being a musician which I'm comfortable with. If I come new to a composer of any period, our own time or the past, a piece of music, an instrument, even to a performing space, my first question, albeit unvoiced, would be, what do I like to do now? What would I like to do now? So for me, this results in a motley, kind of ragbag of approaches, ranging from very targeted, specialized, such as exploring the many tunings, the scordature of the 1680s Klagenfurt manuscript, which has over 100 movements on 7 tunings, on exploring that on a small gut-strung 1685 Stradivari, through to being pretty much eccentric. So playing and recording 1785 Telemann flute fantasies on a violin made by Andrea Amati in 1570, using a tiny late 17th century bow. I'm going to offer a few ideas from my practice in the hope they might be interesting and get our conversations going. I'm fascinated by the exchanges involved in music making, particularly how those ideas are shared between composer, performer, and instrument. Of course, this must always be explored with the proviso that at any time or place, the performer either is or is not the or a composer, or the composer is or not the performer. In every period, this interlocks fascinatingly with the question of whether or not the composer is writing or has written for themselves or for others, and if they're writing for others, whether it's for a specific known artist or collaborator, or for a large cohort, a large group, such as a musically active, music purchasing, amateur music making public. Much of my time is spent in the very smallest scale of music playing, of string playing, playing alone. So please forgive me if I make some of my observations from that standpoint. I'll begin with 2 pictures, which for me figure like one. The first is someone else, and the second is me. The first edition of John Playford's Division Violin, first published in 1684, has a lovely engraving on the title page. A musician, a violinist, sits on a high-backed oak and leather chair, instantly recognizable for anybody who knows anything about 17th century English furniture. He's sitting at a rectangular table, and we can't see whether or not that's covered with a tablecloth or leather. Now, he is playing the violin. To show us what he's doing, the table, as opposed to the music he's playing, it looks as if it's being graffitied with the words Division Violin above the open volume laid on its top. And it's clear that we are to understand that the very happy smile which plays across our musician's face is due to his enjoyment of that music as he plays it. Having played most of the division violin myself, I'm really sure that it is. This is truly enjoyable, wonderful music to play. Musical instruments hang on the wall. On the right, there is either what might be a bass viol or a cello. In the 17th century, there were plenty of instruments made which served as both, such as the Girolamo Amati instrument in the Ashmolean Museum, which is both a cello and a viol. There's also a bow and a kind of crossed pair, right, heraldically represented, of crudely represented wind instruments. Light floods into the room from the double bay leaded windows in the centre. So one thing is clear. A musician is at home. This is music making in the home. It's not clear as if there's an audience, but you could say that question is moot as the violinist, our fiddler, is smiling out of the picture at the artist, or at us, or at me, at you. And the second picture is, well, it's of me. Every night I set up my workspace, my practice space, in our apartment near the River Thames in East London, here in Wapping. I make a pot of verbena tea, get out whichever instrument that I'm going to use, and put my music flat on the work table under a daylight reading lamp. I have a good work chair. In fact, it's my son's old baby chair. It's a Trip Trap, the Danish baby chair, which is wonderful to sit on for a grown-up. And I always sit to practice, and I never use a music stand. Of course, I have a number of tools which aren't really represented on Playford's title page. There are pencils and pens, and my all-important practice mute. But like him, I sit under a very large leaded workshop windows, in fact much bigger. And in the summer, conversation and the occasional clink of glassware can be heard from the walkways of the Victorian building opposite mine, where my neighbours like to sit and talk at night. They can see me, but even if my windows are open, which they always are, they can't hear me. Such are the benefits of the practice mute, the Hoteldämpfer. Most of my music making happens after midnight. I start practice usually at midnight, and most nights finish by 3:30, 4 o'clock. And this, to be honest, is how the majority of my music making happens. I offer this simple comparison between musicians in the 17th and 21st centuries to point out how so much of our personal practice, and I do use the word in the sense that a visual artist uses it, is similar to that of our forebears, who sit in the same spaces we sit now. I can't hear, see, or feel this as being in the past, and perhaps that's a shortcoming on my part. I live in the old docks of London, Wapping, on a curiously dog-legged street, which confuses a lot of delivery drivers and taxi drivers. And the street is the same. I live in the old docks of London, Wapping, in a curiously dog-legged street, which appears, just as it is now, on the 1682 Morgan's map of the whole of London. And I know that there were string instruments here in the late 17th century because our great diarist, Samuel Pepys, tells me so. July the 16th, 1663. By and by, down by water on several deal ships, and stood upon a stage in one place to see caulkers sheathing the ship. Then at Wapping, to my carvers about my viol head. So home, and thence to my viol makers in Bishopsgate Street. His name is Wise, who is a pretty fellow of it. So we know that Samuel Pepys walked the mile or so from his home, which was right behind the Tower of London, on what is now Pepys Street, next to the Church of St. Olaf Hart Street, which is his local church where he had a pew. He walked from here down to the river to look at some people working on a ship, and then walked along the river to where I'm sitting now. And then afterwards, after he got the scroll or the head of his viol looked at, he walked home first of all, and then on to Bishopsgate Street, basically to where Liverpool Street Station stands now, where his viol maker was then. And 4 days later, Pepys says that he meets a plain fiddler, someone more like me. He was always a little bit cutting about violin players. The only time we actually hear of him playing the violin was when he was on board ship. But he meets this plain fiddler at his brother Tom's barber's. Quote, and had my hair cut, while his boy played on the violin, which he spells Vyallin. A plain boy, but hath very good genius, and understands the book very well. Now this plain boy is not only playing for music, but doing it very well. And that's interesting. I'd like to know, would he have a music stand, or was he perhaps like our Playford violinist playing from the table? And there's no doubt that the violin playing provided a bit of a relief from the endless gossip of hairdressers. Then, as now, nothing changes. There's a bit of a tension between the musical expectations of the 17th and 21st century. And it arises, or perhaps arose, there's a tension There's a tension between the musical expectations of the 17th and 21st centuries. This arises, or perhaps arose, from the perhaps temporary moment, I do hope it is, when the majority of people's experience of music became not only non-performing, but in our time it was mediated through various forms of reproduction. This led, over time, to the rather illogical perception, which any musical teacher will recognise with a sigh, that all too often the practice of music was practicing for another event, as opposed to playing at home for its, or wherever you played, for its own sake. So this, for many young people across the world, became confined to graded music exams, which, if you think about it, offer a rather bizarre form of listening. This has changed, and is changing. COVID-19 has accelerated the change. At this moment in lockdown, the majority of music making is happening in the home, from lots of families playing together, through to examples of people like the great multi-instrumentalist Kapellmeister of our time, Jacob Collier, happily back in what he calls his hideaway, the place where he began his YouTube career. And thanks to the modern technology we have, we can see it all. Today, the most in-public music making is in the private sphere, thanks to the internet. I do think that the musicians of listeners of Pepys's age, this is the age of the poet Aphra Behn, or the violinist Nicolas Matthias, or the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor, or Christopher Wren, would identify with that kind of immediacy. My own domestically driven music making informs or misinforms my approach to everything I play. Each time that I gingerly begin exploring a new project, and of course this stretches from the smallest work to large cycles of pieces, I find my way into the project, violin in hand, at my table, just like Playford's violinist. I cannot really say what elements will find their way into the explorations as a project develops, but the majority of my musicking, if I might, happens in that environment, and the attempts to understand are the result of, for me, a highly enjoyable activity that happens every night. Some of the most moving moments with music happen at the desk, and some of them happen when an audience or a space shows us the way. The novelist Charles Palaceo, who some of you will know from the incredibly successful book from the 1990s, where he reanimates the detective world of Wilkie Collins, his book The Quincunx, wrote a novel, Betrayals, which plays with and talks about the various ways that a text or a story is either inert, interferes with, or is interfered with by its reader. The novel contains a fictional academic appendix in which he talks about academic text called Henry Galvanauskas Loosing the Signifier, Silence, Wordlessness and Desire in Kipling's Tongueless Boy, a summary by Graham Speculand. And here he sums up the terrifying swings in hierarchy which are necessary for a text to work. All the more powerfully because Palace's academic text is itself an act of fiction, which messes with the reader, with us, with me or you. And what I'm talking about here is the decisions we all have to make as to whether or not we simply play a piece of music and we have, if you like, an inert relationship with each other. Effectively, that we read what's on the page and we play it and something comes out. Or another way of looking at it would be, does the music insist or demand that we play with it, that we do something to it? And that obvious example of this would be, for instance, the understanding that most of us would have that when we play, say, Baroque music, that it's necessary to think about what ornamentation, what decoration, what improvisation we bring to it, because otherwise the piece of music isn't happening. Or the other example would be music which plays with us, which changes our perception of things, of the world, of music, without us realizing it. An example of that might be the effect psychologically that some minimalist music, particularly using phasing, has on us, where effectively the music reaches into us and changes our perception of the physical world. You might argue, and I certainly would have no argument with you, that some of the greatest music, say an example would be, I don't know, The Marriage of Figaro, does this emotionally, actually wreaks this kind of change on us, whether we like it or not. That the great artists have the ability to reach in and change who we are. But there are always there's going to be those three levels. So here are those three moments. The first put 3 or 4 years ago, when I first received my copy of the astonishing 1685 Klagenfurt manuscript, which I later would release as a doubled CD recording. Now, I must stress that my work on this source is not scholarly, and for the real work, the real understanding, look out the work that the researcher and baroque violinist Pauline Nobas has done. But the facsimile arrived electronically from the very helpful team at the museum in Klagenfurt in Lower Austria, the Landesmuseum for Kärnten. And I waited very impatiently as my printer spooled out the 100-odd sheets. I spend far too much time looking at screens, and I'm not going to start looking at screens to play music. I simply can't bear it. I love paper, I love pencils, I love pens, I love the whole thingness, the quiddity of music making. So eventually the sheets had spooled themselves out, and then I, well, not raced to my desk, but I rushed to my desk with violin, practice mute, and tuning fork. I began to puzzle out the 7 or 8 scordature, the different tunings used in the piece. Now, over the next 4 or 5 hours, I'm not sure whether there was any real audible music making. And I'm not really sure at what point what happened. This is not really a comfortable process. Anybody knows who plays a lot of scordatura will know that, particularly on the violin with our high string tensions, there's a bit of a sense of the wrestling of Jacob and the angel as we kind of wrangle our way towards tunings and bridge placements and hand settings which will work, whilst trying to find a way of either finding an instrument or adjusting the instrument so that the top doesn't shift and warp and adjust too much as we change the tunings on it. But all of that is prologue, and unless things do not go well, to the moment, and this happened in this case, when quite suddenly everything comes clear and what you might call musical plain sailing follows. In my case, that came about 28 movements into the cycle. Suddenly I realised that what I was playing, the music that I was playing, was an absolute beauty. And in that moment I realised that these pieces, these tiny, these tiny jewel-like pieces, were things which I was going to perform and explore for the rest of my life. I put the violin down and went to the other room in the apartment where my wife, who's a writer, was working. I needed to share this. There was nothing I could say. I just needed to know that, curiously for me, I was speechless. It became necessary. This was the moment it became very necessary to go beyond me, my limitations, the desk, the violin, the music, and to go to somebody else and describe my wonder. This, of course, is what drives our need to perform and our need to share and to experience things together. Right back to what I talked about of my experience of the recent live concert. Now, underpinning this small moment of clarity was an awareness that I was working with a source which was designed to be used in the way that I was using it. That it was clear from the layout of pages of this manuscript, recto and verso, that the writer had laid the music out so that I wouldn't have to do any page turns while I was playing it. Now, this might sound a little crude, but it told me that the violinist composer of the material, whoever they are expected were, they expected to be alone when they played it, not to have somebody else turn pages for them. It made sense if, as I suspect, the score was written by and to be played by a nun at the convent where the volume was discovered in modern-day Slovenia. Just to remind ourselves that the earliest surviving, for instance, Western choral music that we have in books was designed to be read by a group of people looking at a large score. So the thing with we're so used to one musician reading from one score is rather different from how something like that was designed to be used. And I think it's also worth saying that in, say, the orchestral world, the majority of music is read by 2 people at one stand. It's Not happening at the moment. Again, COVID is changing now. But that's an interesting convention. And it's not just to do with the convenience of turning pages, the idea that you divide a string section up into pairs, that there are these, if you like, sharing going on. This layout of the music, however, in the Klagenfurt manuscript is the complete opposite of Bach's sonatas and partitas. Now these, whilst they were certainly written for his own use, we know from his son's description he was a very handy violin player, and we know they were very likely written for home use. These are inscribed with, at the bottom of nearly every page, volti subito, volti presto. And these particularly come not only at page turns in the middle of long movements without rests. There are no rests anywhere in the Bach sonatas and partitas. There's no silence. But they also come indicating the pages to be turned quickly at the bottom of individual movements. Go on, turn quickly. Now, I'm not sure that Bach, both with regards to either his family or professional situations, was ever really alone. I mean, this is somebody with 20 children, and all of whom were musically active, is an extraordinary wife. So you could argue there was always somebody to volti subito or volti presto, turn the pages presto, whether it was a family member or a family musician or a fellow musician. Very different from the situation which seems to have happened with the manuscript I was referring to earlier. So my next insight came from the idea of a score which is designed by and for the solitary musician. And this is back to the notion which I've been playing with earlier of the musician as the composer. Here we're looking at the interweave between composing and performing. I do notice that the composer-performer often doesn't distinguish between these activities. And if I think about the number of composers that I work with who are wonderful performers, including people such as Jörg Wedman or Michael Finnessy, or in America, Michael Hirsch, they tend not to distinguish between composition and performance. And very often they find it difficult to separate them from each other in their minds. At a number of points in the Klagenfurt source, we can see the creator's pen running away with itself. We can see improvisation and invention winning out over form and self-discipline. For example, at the peroration at the end of one lovely set of divisions of variations, our composer forgets the 4-bar structure they've been using and kind of noodles on. Anyone who's tried singing Danish hymn tunes will recognize this kind of thing where you get what I describe as a kind of winding tale at the end of such music. But in the case of this manuscript, this piece of music, the audience is so used to the structure of the variations that when this strange tale happens, I've known an audience laugh out loud when it happens. It's not unusual in the manuscript, this Klagenfurt manuscript. It's not a mistake. It's also charming to observe a composer decide when this happens whether or not to correct such an apparent accident. In both this case and another score I really love and have spent many years working on, Giuseppe Tartini's astonishing 30 piccole sonate, you can watch, and I watch and rather play, as the composer realizes an error that they make and crosses out furiously. In Tartini's case, at a number of places in variations, he forgets the number of beats he's supposed to be using in the couplet and turns a 2/4 piece into 3/4 and and in his case, he realizes his mistake and scratches out, irritated with himself. Before I go on, I think it's important to remind myself and to us that what we do as artists is often delving into what happens. I mentioned Michael Finnessy earlier, and if you could say there's one thing which is absolutely at the heart of all of his music, which has a reputation amongst people who don't play it and know it as being just about difficulty and virtuosity. Actually, what at the heart of it is his fascination as to the kind of life that comes to music when musicians do it, and particularly in his case, where musicians do it in the same space. This is something I've learned talking with composers all over the world. I was very lucky in my younger days to work closely with the late Sir Michael Tippett, and I discovered that this sort of musical omnivore was fascinated in what happened when his music was played. And if his music was played twice, he would always ask, what happens next? Now, in my experience, at least one violinist who worked with him, who recorded one of his quartets with Tippett in the room, couldn't understand how to deal with this, because he's come out after doing a take and Tippett would say, oh, that was great, what are you going to do now? When actually what the violinist wanted was some kind of guidance, both for Tippett and for Finnessy, and they're not alone in this. They're fascinated in what happens with their music. If you take it further, if you take the great American composer Gloria Coates, who's lived in Munich for the past 45 years, having worked with her since the early 90s, what's fascinating about her is the way that she listens. She never brings a score to a rehearsal, and her way of listening while you play is to put her head between her hands, and at the end, to look up and say, do you think it works? Now, this sounds like a really strange question, but actually, if you think about it, it's pretty much the only question. The question is not so much whether or not you're executing the score correctly, which is something which some, dare I say it, lesser composers get hung up on, but rather whether or not the music itself, when it becomes alive, when it's living in the space, whether it functions, whether it breathes. Do you think it works? She asks. Of course, there are plenty of composers who want exactly what they want, what they wrote, and you could say, what does that actually mean? And there is those who the type I'm talking about, some who almost give you no guidance at all. This can be confusing, because if you think of a composer like George Kurtag, who puts very little information on the score, it's very, very clear that he has a very clear idea of what he wants and requires the performer, if you like, to kind of excavate the secret. And there are points in between these two. But it is important to work out how much we are duty-bound to interfere or not interfere with the material. And going back to Playford's Violinist at the Table, what we do when we are by ourselves, just instrument, music, room, and player. Now, I mentioned the cycle of Tartini sonatas, which is a 6-hour cycle. When I released it as a cycle of 30, it took 5 discs. These are unaccompanied pieces. When you take a manuscript like this and a cycle like this, it's quite impossible to play these without taking authority over the material. And this is particularly because by the end of this extraordinary manuscript, which is the only complete manuscript we have in Tartini's hand, it's by the end of this manuscript, which was worked on by the composer over a long period of time and for himself, Tartini's propensity for musical shorthand means that we have to start making daring choices, or we have no music. The last sonata of the set, which is contained in full on page 106 of the manuscript, consists of 8 movements. Some of these are fully written out. One requests the repetition of a movement from earlier in the cycle by just having the first bar and then a page number. One demands the, if I can call it, the minorization of a movement in the major from earlier on. And one, which is on line 5 of page 106, the second half of that line, consists of 4 bars in 3/4 and then etc. This was a moment where my practice desk completely failed me. I did not want simply to make up the remainder of a minuet, particularly in the last sonata of a 6-hour cycle of pieces, and a 6-hour cycle of pieces which are of profound musical beauty. Whatever I might make up might not be difficult to produce, but I knew I could not offer more than a vaguely satisfactory solution. Though I completely accepted was the shorthand that Tartini put on the page was everything he would need. The simple problem. Tartini is Tartini. I am not. To be honest, I momentarily gave up, as there were more than 105. There were 105 more pages of music I wanted to worry about, and I sort of stepped away from the problem. A few days later, walking along Lower Thames Street by the river about a mile to the west from here, I found myself standing under another Wren church. We began today talking about a concert at his masterpiece, St Mary Abbot Church. In this case, it was the tower, the wonderful tower of the Church of St Magnus the Martyr, which originally was keyed into Old London Bridge. It's now no longer London Bridge, was moved about 20 feet to the west when it was rebuilt for the third time in the 19th century. I was standing silent for a moment, looking at the tower, as ever astonished at the invention, the creative solution that Christopher Wren and his collaborating artists Hook and Hawksmoor was found for problems of space and light. Suddenly, looking at the tower of the church, an answer came to me, to the Tartini problem. I suddenly realized the melodic material, those pitches which he put in the first two bars of the unfinished minuet, before the etc., was the same, exactly the same pitch-wise, as those of the first two bars of the preceding movement, an aria cantabile in 4/4 time, which occupies the first half of the same line of music on page 106. Surely it couldn't be that simple. Leaning over the wall by the Thames, I, in my head, unrolled the rest of the 4/4 material in 3/4. That 10-bar aria became an 18-bar minuet. I rushed home, grabbed a sheet of manuscript paper, and wrote it out. It worked. Now, I fully accept that Tartini had put me, even though he didn't meant to put anybody in this position, because he was writing this music for himself, not for me. Now, as we all know, personalized scores become mnemonics, the way to remember something, the musical equivalent of a knotted handkerchief, the old way of reminding yourself to do an errand, although I've forgotten when I last heard of that memory trick being used. I know that my grandfather used to do it, because I remember seeing him pull knotted handkerchiefs out of his pocket, which meant remember to buy the milk. Or in the 20th century, the increasing separation between the roles of a composer and performer did lead to increasingly hybrid versions of such reminder scores. The score for Nam June Paik's infamous solo for violin, which I've performed once and only once, is just one such. This I saw in an exhibition in Mexico City where I was playing, as it were, the piece. It consists of a musical stave on which is scrawled around a rough sketch of a violin, quote, "Please ask Ben Patterson how to play it." It's rather amusing. It's a score which results in one thing and one thing only, which is the smashing of a violin. That's the pike. Help me, because how you think about the idea of a reminder, how you get a kind of a artistic nudge towards something, that helped me with my speculative reconstruction of Tartini's note to himself, his knotted handkerchief. Now, I'm the first person to admit that the conclusions or insights that I come to are very likely to be wrong, or the very best provisional. They serve what I am doing at any time as a performer. One of the most fascinating aspects of notation, be, for instance, the nothing there simplicity of one of the enormous Giuseppe Colombi toccatas for solo violin, which consists of 800 bars of quavers and semiquavers with no accidentals, just trailing on and on and on and on with no direction as to what you're supposed to do. Or the opposite, the amazing precision of Marin Murray's notations for bass file, his pièce de viol of 1685, roughly the same time as Colombi was writing his pieces in Modena. Nobody up to the 20th century notated string music in the West with more precision, almost neurotic requirements as to colour and instructions as to how elaborations should be applied. The curious thing is that between these apparently two completely different approaches as to instruct us how to play, each of them seemed to offer the same degree of freedom and latitude. Each technique, neither seems to trammel us as performers. My experience of working with living teachers has taught me that very often the same contradiction can be observed. Composers who notate the least often demand the greatest timbral and expressive exactitude, whether it's written down or not, and vice versa. This brings me to a third example, to instruments. For the whole of my playing life, I've been involved with violin and bow makers, with restorers, the exploration of old and new instrumental designs and technologies. However, unlike quite a lot of my colleagues, I've never succeeded, if I can call it that, in falling in love with a particular instrument. My sense has always been that each violin, each viola, has something to offer, some challenge for me. And this is the same whether or not it's in new, or whether it is new, or whether it's old, in converted state, in baroque state, with gut strings or wire, even a good or a bad instrument. There's no such thing as a musical instrument without its own unique voice and its own story. And perhaps once I've learned to sing with that voice, we learn to sing with that voice and learn its story, it's clear to me, anyone, that elements of it can be transported, transposed. A year and a half ago, I gave a concert of 17th century solo works at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. They have one of the great collections of musical instruments, all the way back from an ancient Egyptian harp up to the most modern electronic instruments, and an unsurpassed collection of chordophones, of string instruments. The concert was on Cremonese violins from their collection, and I alternated between two Antonio Stradivari violins from the mid-1690s. Sometimes that's referred to as the long pattern period. These have names, the Francesca and the Gould. But they're completely different from each other, not because of anything that Stradivarius did. One of these is in modern setup, that is, the setup of the instrument, the tilted neck, the modern bass bar, and metal strings, which are the result of conversions made at the beginning of the 19th century and string technology of the late 19th and 20th century. The other which was restored to a fictive Baroque setup, that's the neck, bridge and bass bar and strings, of course, in the 1970s, and is the only Stradivarius violin which has been restored thus. There are a couple of Stradivarius instruments in early condition, particularly one tenor in Italy, but that's not actually in playing condition. This is the only one that's been pushed back to that. At the start of the concert, I didn't tell the audience which violin I was beginning with, and all of the concert, with the exception of new pieces, was given of music which was directly contemporaneous with the violins. So I didn't tell them what I started with, and to make things more confusing, I began playing this Johann Josef Wilsmeyer piece on the modern Strad with a Bieber bow with scordatura, with the detuning. Particularly because I had begun with the violin detuned, which does make the timbres of even a modern setup instrument bizarre and exciting. Not only was it difficult, I could see and hear, for listeners to discriminate between which of the setups I was using, but it became more and more so for me. The timbres and techniques and colours of one instrument seemed to be travelling from one to the other. This situation, which was very exciting, offered me a contained model of something I realise I've often experienced in the past. An example. I spent over 5 years performing on a long pattern Strad of 1698, which had been known by the great Joseph Joachim instrument. From the very first time that I performed on this, and I didn't really find it until I played on it, the first notes I played on it were of an early, in public that was, of an early Mendelssohn sonata for violin and piano, his Opus 4, which is sometimes called Adieu à Berlin, Farewell to Berlin. And there was an extraordinary reaction from people who knew my playing to hearing that violin, which was, my goodness, what's that? And the tone colours which this instrument offered me gave me insight into a particular range of darker, huskier colours that I explored before. And it's worth asking the question, are those the colours which pertain to the instrument when it was made, the instrument when it was converted, or something which I'm just as fascinated with, the colours which either by what it carries with it or what I associate it with it, the colours which I would associate with Joachim? It's an impenetrable question, but one which we have to ask. It's perhaps the moment where performers, where artists can kind of leap off, because there is an element of clap your hands if you believe in fairies. If you don't clap your hands because you don't believe in fairies, you have to ask the question why you're an artist in the first place. So one of the things which I will be talking about later in the year is whether or not instruments effectively bring the voice or elements or clues to the voice of the people who have played them. Now, I stopped using this Joachim violin regularly in 2013. I haven't touched it since July of that year. I don't even know where it is now. But the material, the stoff that it offered me to my hands, my ears, and my imagination is still with me. I can take that material to other violins, even to other setups. So here's a contradiction. Instruments constantly teach us about music. Okay, that's easy. Music constantly teaches us about instruments. And this gyro-like intersect is rather troubling. It's because everyone has a different point of view as to what can be learnt or not learnt from that intersection. You'll find that some people really believe in it, and some people are doubtful. They can't. They need to be convinced. I tend to play for every team at the same time. Here's a rather crude story which might illustrate the kind of insight that you can gain from spending time with a string instrument of any age. So a few years ago, I had a rare opportunity to record on a beautiful instrument by Giovanni Paolo Maggini. He worked between 1580 and 1630. This was not a Cremonese instrument, but like the instrument I referred to earlier, came from Brescia. Now, unlike most of this master's instruments, it had not been cut down. Maggini made large-size violins, and many of these were violently adjusted in the 19th century to fit the more elegant, as it was perceived then, model of Stradivarius, Amati, and Guarneri instruments coming from Cremona down the road. So the result was the instrument, both in terms of size and sound, was what we violinists like to call a bit of a monster. This was really a fantastic instrument to play and to hold and to look at. These are all important. I think it's worth saying about musical instruments that one of the genius of the design of particularly the string instrument family is what evolved, however it evolved, whether you're talking about lutes or guitars or violins, was something which their players love to hold, to be around. A violinist or a viola player is affectionate to the instrument they're playing as a child is to a soft toy. And that's not an exaggeration. Anybody who's watched a violinist when they're not observed rubbing their face with the scroll of their instrument will know what I'm talking about. I was, as ever, practicing late at night, probably around about 2:30 in the morning, and the only light in the room was the reading lamp over my work table. All of a sudden, as I drew the bow across the strings of this Maggini violin, my nose and my mouth and my eyes filled with an acrid, stinging, burning smell and taste of soot, of ash. The instrument had clearly not been played much in recent years, although it was in wonderful condition, and my protracted practice session had dislodged something inside the soundbox, the legacy of centuries of smoke. I really was stunned, as it had never occurred to me before that for most of its life this instrument had been played around naked flames, from the hearth in the kitchen range to the candles on a music stand or to chandeliers. Now, these days, we do our best to keep string instruments as far from fire as possible. A wonderful Cremonese instrument, a Niccolo Amati, on which I had the privilege to perform and record for a few years, was destroyed early this year in a house fire. I really wasn't ready for how shocking that was going to be. There's a sort of violin-shaped void where that instrument used to be. I think for the first time I can say that the quickest way to understand the importance of a musical instrument for a player is not to take it away from them, but to take it away from them and then tell them it's been destroyed. But back to the Maggini, that sensation, the smell, the stink that briefly emanated from this absolutely beautiful violin reminded me of the importance of the osmosis that constantly happens between instrument and players, and between instrument and composition and composer and player, and between all these things and audiences, and what comes back from the audience, what comes back from the room. Because obviously there's a parallel between, for instance, the inside of an instrument and the inside of the chamber in which it is being played. We can't ever be sure whether the insight that we're going to find or offer from this process is going to be prosaic or profound, transforming or banal, but I think we can safely say that it's vital that we allow it to happen.